The soft hum of the airplane's engines filled the luxurious first-class cabin as passengers settled in for the long-haul flight. The atmosphere was calm, almost serene, with attendants moving gracefully up and down the aisle, catering to their guests. Among the travelers was a man who seemed to carry a quiet yet undeniable presence. Dressed in an impeccably tailored suit, he exuded a confidence that turned heads. But despite his polished exterior, he preferred to keep a low profile, focusing on the tablet in his hands rather than the attention his arrival had sparked. He wasn't just anyone. Beneath the composed demeanor and understated style lay a man who had built an empire from scratch, one of the world's youngest and most successful billionaires. However, he had no interest in flaunting his wealth or status. For him, life was about staying grounded and treating everyone with respect, no matter their position in society. Seated quietly in his corner, he barely noticed the flurry of activity as a flight attendant approached his row. She was poised, with a polished uniform and a practiced smile that could charm anyone. But behind her professional exterior, there was a subtle tension, something in her demeanor that hinted at a day not going quite as planned. As she reached his seat, her tone shifted. What started as polite turned curt, and within moments, her attitude seemed uncomfortably sharp. At first, he thought little of it. People had bad days, he understood that better than most. But as their interaction unfolded, it became clear this wasn't just a fleeting moment of stress. Her voice carried a sharpness, her words dripping with disdain. The other passengers began to notice the exchange. Whispers rippled through the cabin as eyes darted toward the unfolding scene. He remained calm, choosing not to escalate things. Still, her actions became increasingly dismissive, as though she had made an assumption about him that fueled her behavior. "Sir, if you're going to sit here, you need to follow instructions properly," she snapped, her voice loud enough to draw more attention. He looked up, his calm gaze meeting hers. "I'm sorry, is there an issue?" he asked, his voice steady but measured. She scoffed, her irritation barely concealed. "Just listen next time, all right?" It wasn't the words that stunned the onlookers, it was the tone, the way she looked at him, as though he didn't belong there. A few passengers exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort with the interaction evident. He noticed it too, but instead of responding with anger, he simply nodded and returned to his tablet. But it didn't end there. Minutes later, as drinks were being served, she returned, her mood seemingly even worse. As she leaned over to offer a beverage, her hand slipped, spilling the drink across his lap. Gasps echoed through the cabin. "I'm sorry, sir," she said, though her tone lacked genuine remorse. "Perhaps you should have been more careful." The billionaire set his tablet aside, calmly reaching for a napkin. His composure remained intact, though a flicker of something sharper, something calculating flashed in his eyes. "It's fine," he said simply, his tone giving no indication of the thoughts racing behind his expression. But then, the unthinkable happened. As he attempted to clean himself up, her frustration boiled over. Perhaps it was the weight of her day, or maybe something else entirely, but the flight attendant did something no one in the cabin could have predicted. In a moment of sheer audacity, she raised her hand and slapped him across the face. The cabin fell silent, the stunned expressions of the passengers reflecting their disbelief. For a few moments, it felt as though time had stopped. He slowly turned back to her, his expression unreadable, though the tension in his jaw spoke volumes. The air grew thick with anticipation. What would he do? Would he lash out? Raise his voice? Call for the captain? Instead, he leaned back in his seat, a faint, enigmatic smile playing on his lips. "You've made your point," he said quietly, his voice calm yet chilling in. It's certainty. The silence that followed was deafening. The passengers, the crew, everyone seemed frozen, unsure of what might happen next. 2 minutes later it began. The plane remained silent, the slaps still echoing in the minds of everyone present. The billionaire didn't move right away. His calm demeanor was unsettling, like the stillness before a storm. The flight attendant stood frozen, perhaps realizing she had gone too far, but something in her stance hinted at defiance. Her eyes darted toward the other crew members for support, but they looked away, unwilling to involve themselves in what had just transpired. The man leaned forward, carefully adjusting his cufflinks, as if the chaos around him were of no concern. He then looked up, his gaze meeting hers with unnerving calmness. "I'm going to ask you one question," he said softly, his voice steady yet piercing. "Is this how you treat all your passengers? Or am I just a lucky one?" She hesitated, her composure cracking for the briefest moment. "I didn't mean," she stammered, but he raised a hand, silencing her without a single word. The other passengers watched in rapt silence. Some were angry on his behalf, while others appeared fearful of what might unfold next. It wasn't every day you witnessed such a blatant display of disrespect, especially towards someone who carried himself with such quiet authority. Across the aisle, a young woman exchanged glances with her husband. "Do you think he'll report her?" she whispered. "He has to, right? You can't just do something like that and get away with it." Her husband shook his head, his gaze fixed on the man. "I don't know," he murmured. "But something tells me he's not the type to forget." The billionaire finally stood, brushing a hand over his suit as if to erase the memory of the incident. Without a word, he walked past the flight attendant, making his way toward the front of the plane. The whispers grew louder, passengers craning their necks to see what he would do. But instead of causing a scene, he quietly disappeared into the first-class lounge, leaving everyone in suspense. The flight attendant exhaled shakily, her hand trembling as she picked up the drink cart. She knew she should apologize, perhaps even beg for forgiveness, but her pride held her back. Something about his calmness unnerved her more than if he had yelled or demanded to speak with her supervisor. Meanwhile, in the private lounge, the billionaire sat alone, his mind racing. He wasn't angry in the traditional sense, he had dealt with worse in his life. But this wasn't about the slap or even the spilled drink. It was about principle, about the quiet prejudice that he had spent his entire life confronting in subtle, unspoken ways. He had worked hard to get where he was, sacrificing countless nights, enduring endless doubt from those who couldn't see past the color of his skin. Yet here he was, in the highest echelon of society, still being treated as though he didn't belong. He pulled out his phone, his fingers gliding over the screen with practiced ease. A few taps later, a text was sent, though its contents were known only to him. He leaned back, his expression unreadable, and waited. Back in the cabin, the tension lingered like a storm cloud. Passengers avoided eye contact with the flight attendant, afraid of being drawn into the unfolding drama. One older gentleman finally broke the silence, shaking his head as he muttered to himself. "Unbelievable. You'd think people would know better by now." The flight attendant overheard him but pretended not to. Her hands clenched tightly around the cart handle as she tried to focus on her tasks. But her mind was elsewhere, replaying the events over and over. What if he really was someone important? What if her actions had consequences beyond this flight? Minutes passed, then an hour. The billionaire hadn't returned to his seat, leaving the passengers to speculate wildly about what he might be planning. "I heard he's some kind of tech mogul," one man whispered to his seatmate. "Worth billions. Can you imagine if he decides to sue the airline? Or worse," the seatmate replied, lowering his voice. "People like him have connections. That flight attendant might not have a job by the time we land." Unbeknownst to them, the billionaire wasn't thinking about lawsuits or firing anyone. His focus was elsewhere, on something deeper and more impactful. This wasn't about revenge, it was about making a statement, about holding people accountable for their actions in a way that couldn't be ignored. 2 hours into the flight, the plane hit a patch of turbulence, jolting the passengers out of their whispered conversations. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and the captain's calm voice reassured everyone that it was just a minor disturbance. but the turbulence seemed to mirror the unease in the cabin. The flight attendant, now visibly anxious, avoided looking toward the empty seat where the billionaire had been. She busied herself with tasks, hoping to blend into the background. Then, without warning, he returned. He walked down the aisle with the same quiet confidence as before, his expression giving nothing away. He didn't look at her, didn't acknowledge the curious stares from the other passengers. Instead, he sat down, adjusted his seatbelt, and resumed working on his tablet as though nothing had happened. The flight attendant hesitated, then approached cautiously. "Sir," she began, her voice quieter now, almost apologetic. "About earlier I didn't mean to." He raised a hand, stopping her mid-sentence. "Save it," he said calmly, his tone neutral but firm. "Whatever you have to say, I don't need to hear it." Her face flushed, and she stepped back, unsure of what to do. For the rest of the flight, she kept her distance, her earlier confidence replaced by a nervous energy that everyone could sense. As the plane began its descent, the anticipation among the passengers reached its peak. What would happen when they landed? Would the billionaire let the incident go, or was something bigger already in motion? The flight attendant, now visibly shaken, did her best to maintain professionalism as she made the final announcements. But the tension in her voice betrayed her inner turmoil. When the plane touched down, the passengers began gathering their belongings, their chatter filled with speculation about what they had just witnessed. The billionaire remained seated, waiting until the aisle cleared before standing. He adjusted his tie, picked up his carry-on, and walked toward the exit. As he passed the flight attendant, he paused, turning to face her. For a moment, their eyes met, and she thought she saw a flicker of something: pity, perhaps, or disappointment. But he said nothing, stepping past her and disappearing into the terminal. It wasn't until the passengers had disembarked that the first ripple of his actions began to surface. The flight attendant's supervisor appeared at the cabin door, her expression grim. She pulled the attendant aside, speaking in hushed tones that no one else could hear. Whatever was said left the flight attendant pale and visibly shaken. She nodded stiffly, her hands trembling as she clutched the edge of the drink cart. Meanwhile, in the bustling airport terminal, the billionaire walked with purpose, his phone pressed to his ear. "Yes," he said simply. "It's been handled. But make sure it doesn't stop here." Whoever was on the other end of the line responded, their voice too faint to hear. The billionaire nodded, a faint smile crossing his lips. "Good. Then let's make sure this sends the right message." And just like that, he disappeared into the crowd, leaving behind a story that no one on that plane would ever forget. The flight wasn't over, it had just begun. The terminal buzzed with the typical chaos of arrivals: families reuniting, business people rushing to their next meetings, and travelers dragging their luggage to waiting cabs. Amid the hustle, the billionaire moved with a deliberate calm, his presence commanding attention even in the anonymity of the crowd. He walked toward a sleek, black car waiting just outside the terminal. The driver stepped out, opening the door with a respectful nod. Without a word, the billionaire climbed in, his expression unreadable as the car pulled away from the curb. Inside the vehicle, he pulled out his phone again, glancing at the flurry of notifications lighting up the screen. Messages from his team poured in, each one more urgent than the last. He tapped on one of the messages, reading it carefully. His jaw tightened ever so slightly, though his face remained calm. "Proceed," he said into the phone after dialing a number. His voice was steady, the kind of calm that carried weight. Whoever was on the other end responded quickly, confirming something he had been expecting. Back at the airport, the flight attendant was ushered into a private room by her supervisor. The door closed behind them, and the faint hum of conversations in the terminal was replaced by an oppressive silence. The supervisor's face was stern, her gaze piercing as she set down a clipboard on the small table between them. "Do you understand the severity of what happened today?" the supervisor asked, her tone leaving no room for excuses. The flight attendant's hands were clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. "I didn't mean for it to escalate," she said quietly, her voice trembling. It was a mistake. The supervisor sighed, rubbing her temples. A mistake doesn't justify your actions. Do you have any idea who that passenger is? The flight attendant hesitated, her eyes darting nervously. She shook her head, though deep down, she suspected the truth. He's not just a billionaire, the supervisor continued. He's one of the most influential people in the world. The kind of person who doesn't need to raise his voice to bring down an entire corporation. And now, because of your behavior, we're all under scrutiny. The flight attendant's stomach dropped. She wanted to argue, to explain herself, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she sat there, the weight of her actions sinking in with every passing second. Meanwhile, the billionaire's car pulled into the driveway of an imposing building in the heart of the city. The driver stepped out, opening the door as the man exited with a calm precision. He walked through the glass doors into a lobby that exuded power, sleek marble floors, towering ceilings, and a staff that moved with quiet efficiency. He made his way to a private elevator, scanning his ID card to gain access. The elevator whisked him upward, the numbers on the panel glowing softly as they ascended. When the doors opened, he stepped into a spacious office with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of the city skyline. Several members of his team were already waiting for him, their faces tense but focused. They stood as he entered, their voices quieting immediately. "What's the status?" he asked, setting his phone on the table and looking around the room. One of his advisors stepped forward, holding a tablet with a detailed report. "We've compiled everything," she said. "Footage from the flight, witness statements from the passengers, and a full background check on the attendant in question. We're ready to proceed with the next steps." He nodded, his gaze fixed on the screen as she scrolled through the evidence. The video from the plane played silently, the moment of the slap captured in crystal clear detail. His expression didn't change as he watched, though the room seemed to grow colder. "And the airline?" he asked, his tone measured. "They're aware of the incident and are conducting their own investigation," another advisor replied. "But it's clear they're trying to minimize the fallout. They've already reached out to offer compensation and a formal apology." The billionaire leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he considered his options. "This isn't about money or apologies," he said finally, his voice low but resolute. "This is about accountability. If we let this go unchecked, it sends the wrong message not just to her, but to everyone who thinks they can act with impunity." The room fell silent as his words hung in the air. His team exchanged glances, understanding the gravity of what was about to happen. Back at the airport, the flight attendant sat alone in the break room, her head in her hands. The reality of her situation was sinking in, the fear of losing her job and the uncertainty of what might come next gnawing at her. She checked her phone, hoping for some kind of distraction, but instead found social media ablaze with speculation about the incident. Passengers from the flight had started posting about what they had witnessed, their accounts quickly gaining traction. Some sided with her, claiming the billionaire had overreacted, while others condemned her actions, calling for immediate repercussions. The flight attendant's heart raced as she scrolled through the comments. Each new post felt like a blow, a reminder that her actions were now public knowledge. She knew there was no escaping the fallout. Whatever came next, she would have to face it. As the day wore on, the tension continued to build. The billionaire's team worked tirelessly, coordinating with legal experts, PR strategists, and other key players to ensure that every step was calculated and deliberate. The goal wasn't revenge, it was to set a precedent, to show that actions have consequences, no matter who you are. By the time the sun set, the stage was set for the next move. The billionaire stood by the window of his office, looking out at the city as the lights began to twinkle in the distance. He thought about the countless people who had doubted him, who had tried to undermine him at every turn. This wasn't just about one flight attendant or one slap, it was about something bigger. He turned away from the window, his expression calm but resolute. "Let's make sure this doesn't get forgotten," he said to his team. "Not by her, not by the airline, and not by anyone watching. The tension reached its peak as the pieces fell into place. The next move was his to make, and everyone his team, the airline, the passengers, and even the flight attendant waited with bated breath to see what he would do. As the city's skyline glimmered under the night sky, the billionaire's office buzzed with quiet activity. His team was finishing the final steps of their strategy when an unexpected notification popped up on one of their screens. It was from a prominent media outlet, and the headline made everyone pause: Billionaire faces backlash over airline incident. The advisor who noticed it read the article aloud, her voice laced with concern. "It looks like someone's trying to spin the narrative," she said, scrolling through the page. "They're claiming you overreacted and that this was a misunderstanding." The billionaire leaned forward, his gaze narrowing as he absorbed the words. The article painted the incident as a minor dispute blown out of proportion, subtly framing him as the aggressor despite the clear evidence to the contrary. Even worse, it quoted an anonymous source from the airline, suggesting that he had been demanding and difficult throughout the flight. His jaw tightened, but his expression remained calm. "Who released this?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying an unmistakable edge. "We're looking into it," another advisor replied, already typing furiously on her laptop. "It's too coordinated to be a coincidence. Someone's trying to protect the airline or maybe the flight attendant herself." The billionaire nodded, his mind racing. This wasn't just about the slap anymore. It was a calculated effort to discredit him, to shift the focus away from the real issue. Whoever was behind it underestimated him, though. He wasn't one to back down, especially not when the stakes were this high. "Let them play their games," he said after a moment. "We stick to the facts. The truth is on our side, and we'll make sure it's heard." Even as he spoke, his phone buzzed with another notification. This time, it was a direct message from someone unexpected, a passenger who had been on the flight. The message was simple but loaded with implications. "I saw everything. If you need someone to speak up, I'm here." He stared at the message for a moment before responding with a brief thank you. This was a reminder that not everyone was falling for the smear campaign. People had seen what happened, and many were ready to stand by the truth. Meanwhile, in a small apartment on the outskirts of the city, the flight attendant sat hunched over her own phone, her face pale as she scrolled through the growing storm of comments online. The backlash wasn't limited to the billionaire anymore. Her name had surfaced, and with it, a flood of anger and accusations. Some users dug up old social media posts, twisting them into evidence of her character. Others speculated about her motivations, turning her life into fodder for public debate. Her phone buzzed with a call from an unfamiliar number. She hesitated before answering, her voice shaky. "Hello?" The voice on the other end was firm but not unkind. "This is the airline's legal team. We need to talk about your next steps." Her stomach dropped. "Am I being fired?" "Not yet," the voice replied, though the words carried little comfort. "But the situation is escalating, and we need to protect the company. That means you'll need to stay out of the public eye for now. No interviews, no statements, nothing." She nodded numbly, barely processing the instructions. When the call ended, she stared at the blank screen, the weight of her decisions pressing down on her. For the first time, she wondered if an apology could have prevented all of this. But it was too late for what-ifs. Back at the office, the billionaire's team uncovered a crucial detail: a connection between the anonymous source in the article and a high-ranking executive at the airline. It wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to suggest that the smear campaign wasn't just the work of rogue individuals. This was a coordinated effort, likely approved at the highest levels. "That changes things," one of his advisors said, her tone grim. "If the airline's involved, they're playing a dangerous game. But it also means we have more leverage." The billionaire nodded, his mind already working through the implications. He wasn't surprised. People in positions of power often went to great lengths to protect their own, even at the expense of justice. But this wasn't just about him anymore, it was about setting an example, about ensuring that no one else would have to face what he had endured. As the night deepened, another twist emerged. A leaked internal memo from the airline began circulating online, revealing that the company had been aware of issues with the flight attendant before the incident. The memo detailed complaints from other passengers about her behavior, suggesting a pattern of unprofessional conduct that had been ignored or dismissed. The leak changed everything. Public sentiment began to shift, with many questioning why the airline had allowed her to continue working despite the complaints. The focus was no longer solely on the billionaire, it was now on the airline's handling of the situation and their apparent attempts to cover it up. In the midst of the chaos, the billionaire received another unexpected message. This one came from someone claiming to be a former employee of the airline. The message was cryptic but intriguing. There's more to this than you realize. If you're serious about exposing the truth, we should talk. The stakes had never been higher. The smear campaign, the leaked memo, and the cryptic message all pointed to something bigger, a web of hidden truths and systemic failures that extended far beyond one flight or one slap. The billionaire knew he was on the brink of uncovering something significant, but he also knew that the closer he got to the truth, the more resistance he would face. As the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, the tension reached a boiling point. The billionaire's next move would determine not only the outcome of this battle but also the broader message it would send. Everyone, his team, the airline, the passengers, and even the flight attendant, was bracing for what came next. The morning air buzzed with tension as the billionaire prepared for a press conference. The event had been arranged at the last minute, with his team working through the night to ensure everything was ready. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras and microphones poised to capture every moment. Outside, the public gathered, their voices a mix of curiosity and speculation. Everyone wanted to know how this story would end. The billionaire stepped onto the stage, his expression calm yet resolute. The murmurs in the room died down as he began to speak. He addressed the incident on the flight, recounting the events with clarity and precision. He didn't embellish or accuse, he simply laid out the facts, letting the truth speak for itself. Then, he turned his attention to the broader issue: the need for accountability, not just for individuals but for the systems that enable misconduct to thrive. As someone who has built their life on integrity and hard work, I cannot stand by and allow this to go unchecked, he said, his voice steady. This is about more than one moment or one person. It's about creating a culture where respect and fairness are non-negotiable. The room erupted in applause, but he wasn't finished. With a nod to one of his advisors, he signaled for the screen behind him to light up. A video began to play, showing excerpts from the leaked internal memo and statements from past employees who had come forward. The evidence painted a damning picture of the airline's negligence and its attempts to cover up a pattern of misconduct. The room fell silent as the weight of the revelation sank in. But just as the narrative seemed to settle into a clear resolution, the unexpected happened. A woman in the audience stood up, her hand trembling as she held the microphone. It was the flight attendant. Gasps rippled through the crowd as she introduced herself, her voice shaking but determined. "I didn't come here to defend myself," she began, her eyes scanning the room. "What I did was wrong, and I take full responsibility for my actions. But there's more to this story that I need to share." The billionaire's expression didn't change, but his eyes narrowed slightly as he listened. The flight attendant went on to explain that she had been under immense pressure from her superiors, who had ignored her repeated requests for support. She admitted that her behavior on the flight had been unacceptable, but she also revealed that the airline had fostered a toxic work environment that pushed employees to their breaking points. "They knew I was struggling," she said, her voice cracking. "But instead of helping me, they buried the complaints and left me to deal with it on my own. I'm not excusing what I did, but I want people to understand that the system failed me, too." The audience was stunned. The story had taken yet another unexpected turn, shifting the focus from individual accountability to systemic failure. The billionaire watched her closely, his mind racing as he processed her words. For the first time, he saw not just an adversary but a person, a flawed, human individual caught in a web of circumstances far larger than herself. When she finished speaking, the room was silent. The billionaire stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "What you've said doesn't erase what happened," he began. "But it does shine a light on something bigger, something that needs to change." He paused, glancing at the audience before turning back to her. "I appreciate your honesty, and I hope this is a step toward accountability not just for you, but for everyone involved." The tension in the room lifted slightly, replaced by a sense of resolution. The flight attendant nodded, her expression a mix of relief and regret. The billionaire then announced his plans to establish a foundation dedicated to addressing workplace toxicity and promoting respect and fairness across industries. It was a move that turned the story from one of conflict to one of hope, a chance to create lasting change. But just as the press conference seemed to wind down, the final twist came. One of the reporters raised a hand, asking a question. That caught everyone off guard. "Mr. Davis, is it true that you've just acquired a controlling stake in the airline?" The room erupted in whispers as the billionaire smiled faintly. "Yes," he said simply. "As of this morning, I've taken steps to ensure that this airline and its leadership are held to the highest standards of accountability." The audience was stunned. In one move, the billionaire had not only addressed the immediate conflict but also positioned himself to enact systemic change from within. It was a masterstroke, the kind of resolution that left no room for doubt about his commitment to fairness and justice. As the press conference ended, the billionaire walked off the stage, his team close behind. The flight attendant lingered for a moment, watching him go before slipping out a side door. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, a chance to start over, to learn from her mistakes, and to rebuild. Outside, the crowd buzzed with energy, their voices filled with a mix of surprise and admiration. The story had reached its climax, but its impact was only just beginning. The billionaire's actions had set a precedent, one that would ripple far beyond the confines of the airport or the headlines. And as he stepped into his car, he allowed himself a small, satisfied smile, knowing that he had not just won a battle but started a movement. As the car pulled away from the press conference venue, the billionaire sat in thoughtful silence. The day's events replayed in his mind, the revelations, the unexpected confession, and the decisions he had made in response. His team, seated around him, exchanged glances but knew better than to interrupt his train of thought. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't the end," he said, looking at his closest advisor. "Acquiring the airline was just the first step. Now, we have to deliver on the promise of change. People are watching, and we can't let them down." His advisor nodded. "We'll start with a full audit," she said. "Identify the weak points, restructure the leadership, and implement the new workplace policies you outlined. It won't be easy, but it's doable." The billionaire nodded in agreement. He knew the road ahead would be challenging, but he also knew it was necessary. This wasn't just about fixing one company, it was about setting an example for an entire industry. And if anyone could navigate the complexities of such a mission, it was him. Meanwhile, the flight attendant was taking her own steps toward accountability. She had resigned from the airline, a decision that had been both difficult and freeing. The fallout from the incident had been overwhelming, but standing up and sharing her truth at the press conference had given her a sense of agency she hadn't felt in years. She began attending counseling sessions and enrolled in courses to help her better understand conflict resolution and emotional regulation. She didn't want her actions to define her, she wanted to grow from them. The billionaire's foundation quickly became a focal point of attention. Its mission to combat workplace toxicity resonated with employees and leaders across industries. Stories began to pour in, some heartbreaking, others inspiring, about the challenges people faced in their jobs and the courage it took to speak up. The foundation organized workshops, offered resources for employees in need, and pushed for legislative changes to better protect workers. It wasn't just a PR move, it was a genuine effort to create lasting change. The airline itself underwent a complete transformation under its new leadership. The billionaire ensured that the employees at all levels were heard, addressing long-standing issues that had been ignored for far too long. A new code of conduct was introduced, emphasizing respect, fairness, and transparency. Managers were retrained, and a robust system for reporting and addressing grievances was put in place. Slowly but surely, the culture began to shift. The flight attendant, now a few months removed from the incident, decided to reach out to the billionaire. It wasn't an easy decision. She wasn't sure how he would respond or if he would even agree to meet her. But she felt it was important to express her gratitude and to let him know how much she had learned from the experience. To her surprise, he accepted her request. They met in a quiet CAF, away from the prying eyes of the media. She arrived early, nervously fidgeting with her coffee cup as she waited. When he walked in, she stood to greet him, her hands trembling slightly. He offered a polite smile and a handshake before taking a seat across from her. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me," she said, her voice steady despite the emotions bubbling beneath the surface. "I know I'm probably the last person you wanted to hear from." He shook his head. "You're not," he replied. "I appreciate that you reached out. It takes courage to do that." She nodded, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I wanted to apologize again for what happened. And I wanted to thank you for how you handled everything, for not just seeking revenge but actually working to fix the bigger issues. You didn't have to do that." The billionaire studied her for a moment before responding. "It wasn't just about me," he said. "It was about making sure no one else has to go through something like this on either side. I'm glad to see you're taking steps to move forward." Their conversation lasted for over an hour. It wasn't easy, but it was honest. By the time they parted ways, there was a sense of closure between them. They might never fully reconcile their past, but they had both grown from the experience, and that was enough. In the months that followed, the story began to fade from the headlines, replaced by new scandals, triumphs, and tragedies. But its impact lingered. The airline became a case study in corporate accountability, and the billionaire's foundation continued to inspire change. Employees across industries felt emboldened to speak up, knowing there were people and organizations willing to fight for them. The billionaire, for his part, continued to lead by example. He remained deeply involved in the foundation's work, often meeting with employees, activists, and lawmakers to discuss ways to improve workplace culture. His actions spoke louder than his words ever could, cementing his reputation as a leader who didn't just talk about change but actively pursued it. The flight attendant also found a new path. She eventually started working with organizations that focused on mental health and workplace wellness, using her own experiences to help others. It wasn't the life she had envisioned for herself, but it was meaningful, and it gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in a long time. As the year came to a close, the billionaire stood on the balcony of his home, overlooking the city that had been both the backdrop and the battleground for this chapter of his life. He reflected on everything that had happened, the challenges, the surprises, the lessons learned. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Sometimes, he thought, life throws you into situations you never could have imagined. And sometimes, those situations are exactly what you need to grow, to change, and to make a difference. He turned back toward the house, ready to face whatever came next, knowing that he had the strength, the resources, and the resolve to handle it. The story had come to an end, but its impact would ripple on, touching lives in ways that neither he nor anyone else could fully predict. It was a reminder that even in the face of conflict and adversity, there is always the possibility for growth, redemption, and change. And that, perhaps, was the greatest lesson of all.